Political view. South Africa featured prominently in the New York Times this weekend, not for very good.
I believe in Nelson Mandela's vision.
Called South Africa Vows to End Corruption. Are its new leaders part of the problem? Now, details how Deputy President David Mabuza has risen within the ranks of the ANC, even though education was, in the view of the paper, a shambles in Mpumalanga Province when he was the premier of that province. Let's get an overall political view. We're joined by analyst Lukhona Mnguni from our studio in Durban. Lukhona, thank you for being with us. So, yet more bad press globally.
Good evening, Francis. Definitely not a pleasing story to be focusing on, but I think it comes as no surprise that people are probably sobering up to the aftermath of the Nasrec conference. Just shortly before the conference, I'd actually penned a piece that it would probably be in the best interest of the ANC for both factions to actually work collectively to try and stop then Premier David Mabuza to becoming Deputy President. And that was because stories that were coming out of Mpumalanga were not pleasing, and they were not saying this is the person who should be second in command of our country. Yes, he'll make the argument, as some of his supporters do, that says he's never been convicted in any court of law. But I think the very fact that there are so much of overwhelming perceptions about the poorness of his leadership, and also a type of vindictive leadership style. I mean, if you remember well, before political killings became a problem here in KwaZulu-Natal, for example, they had found quite great prominence in Mpumalanga, especially with whistleblowers who were trying to stand up against corruption in that province. So definitely this comes to me at least as no surprise, but it does communicate that I think by far and large we are starting to recover from the Nasrec sort of Ramaphoria, and starting to interrogate quite piercingly whether or not the leadership collective that surrounds Cyril Ramaphosa gives any confidence to the ordinary South African who must make a decision on who to vote for come elections next year.
All right, so you've pointed to another troublesome province. You're in KwaZulu-Natal, and there seemed to be a lot of inaction for a while, a lot of reasons about arrest. Just give us your view on Becky Ele coming into the province last week on the announcement of a new inquiry.
I think that was very important for the Minister of Police to be seen as taking charge. Ele is also, of course, from KwaZulu-Natal. He has worked a great deal here, and he knows the province very well. For some time, one has been saying that what is needed is political will to actually deal with these issues. Generally, people know or have an idea who is in charge of behind a particular hit. And yes, of course, some politicians have died, not because they were killed for political reasons, but it may appear so. But you need someone who's going to clarify this. But further, Francis, you need to go beyond just apprehending suspects and all of this. We need to get to the people behind the scenes, the people that order some of these hits, because therein lies the biggest problem. Because if you arrest the person who presses the trigger, that is neither here nor there, because it doesn't eliminate a culture of violence among politicians using, of course, some very vulnerable people in our society who are bought for small money, and then they go and kill people. So it's important for the minister to maintain a presence. It's important for the minister to continue having a team of police that are not only from KZN but also outsiders, because at times local police don't act on some of these killings because of the people that are implicated, and they still have to go back to some of their communities. After all, they are human beings, and I do not think they would open themselves up to being vulnerable in that way. So this is a very important step one must welcome.
Well, you've pointed to the secret ingredients, many would say real political will. So you say it's there now.
I think the political will is there. Remember, one of the nice things about elections is that they create incentives for politicians to act. So it might be that the political will is induced by the fact that the ANC wants to be seen as doing something about these political killings. They've been a very much a red herring in their leadership, and of course, because they served a purpose politically, that's why we call them political killings. People are not dying for noble reasons. Someone is eliminating another so that the ground may be fertile for whatever political outcome they wish for. So now there seems to be that political will. Of course, political will must be backed by resources, and political will must be backed by consistency in the actions of the minister. And I think as the passage of time goes on, we will be able to see if all of that comes as a collective.
All right, so talking about action now, UCT has launched its own inquiry into the death of Professor Bongani Mayosi. Is it worth asking to what extent the political stress around that fees must fall time around those protests played a real part in his suicide?
Well, Francis, it's important that we have, for me, a much wider conversation. Yes, fees must fall definitely had many dark parts to it. The manner in which students conducted some of the protests, and the manner in which some people were intimidated, harassed, and all of that in the course of that action. However, for me, I then say, yes, well and good, fees must fall happened, and all these vitriolic remarks were made against the person of Mayosi. But what necessitated fees must fall to begin with? It is these institutional cultures that started off, of course, with Roads Must Fall at UCT, and we started having a conversation. The real question here is a question of transformation and how we repurpose our universities to be accommodative of black academics, black excellence in these institutions. Generally, if you talk to any manager who is black, even without fees must fall, in these institutions of higher learning, they tell you about the stress and strain that they have to pull through each and every day, the untransformed landscape of academia, the lack of accountability in academia, where civil society, as I've been arguing for a long time, has neglected higher education. And as a result, managers, leaders, they behave willy-nilly in a manner that is not accountable. Councils are these hoarded institutions, which of course does not help with the transformative agenda. Our senates are still very much untransformed because, of course, the pool of black professors and all of that is not enough to actually sit in the Senate and all of that. So for me, we need to have a much wider conversation to say black academics have been complaining for some time about their experiences in these institutions. Yes, you compound that with fees must fall, it creates a greater burden on the black leader. But all I'm saying is, if we must not use Mayosi's death particularly to scapegoat the role of UCT as an institution. The UCT inquiry must be about how do you make UCT a conducive space for black academics, a conducive space for black academics to thrive and lead without this institutional backlash. And where does the institutional backlash come from? We need to start identifying, because we all know, those of us who are in the sector, some of the people who are spoilers for the transformation agenda, and we don't want to tackle them head on. And I think that's what needs to happen at UCT.
So you're so right. We often talk about holding government to account, and then the private sector, companies, but not often educational management. Lukhona, last question, and if we can go back to David Mabuza, this massive spread in the New York Times, and it brings something to mind. You know, you were talking about the factions, President Cyril Ramaphosa, questions being asked, has he perhaps sacrificed too much for unity? I'd like your final comment with that.
I think before he sacrificed for unity, he sacrificed for his own ascendancy, and therefore allowed himself to be part and parcel of these shenanigans, because generally he wanted it at all costs. And I think that's where the problem starts. You then want unity simply because you've got to keep yourself in that seat of power. One thing that has always struck me in South Africa generally is that our politicians tend to want it at all costs, irrespective of the reputational and the personal damage that it may do to them. In the long term, of course, the factions of the ANC are going to realign themselves. They are still there. They are bubbling under the surface. People are finding new allies and all of that. So unity by its nature is not absent, is not present, in the ANC. It's actually still a very fractured movement. It appears in the speech of the leaders, but not in the existential reality of the ANC as an organization.
All right, thank you very much for your analysis. That was our weekly feature with Lukhona Mnguni, and it's called The Political View. Stay with us after the break. We'll be bringing you some sporting action. That breaking news, of course, good news for our viewers on SABC platforms around the PSL, and more with Simon after the break.